The ocean was supposed to be their last refuge, the silent kingdom of shadows where no aircraft could see them, no destroyer could find them, and no enemy could strike first. For years, the Imperial Japanese Navy's submarines had prowled the Pacific depths like ghosts, vanishing into the cold darkness after every attack. They had sunk battleships, ambushed convoys, and struck terror into the hearts of Allied sailors. But by 1944, the silence that once protected them had turned into a trap. The crew of the Japanese submarine I-177 knew this truth too late. Beneath the restless waves south of Okinawa, their sonar operator leaned close to his headphones, his face pale. "Unusual echoes," he whispered. The captain frowned. There was no ship nearby. Yet something was there, surrounding them. Small metallic pings rippled through the water, faint but deliberate, like a pulse in the deep. Within minutes, the men realized what it was. They were being hunted. Above them, a U.S. Navy patrol aircraft dropped a pattern of strange devices into the sea, cylindrical floats bobbing silently on the surface. These were Sonar Buoys, the newest invention in underwater warfare. Linked by radio, they could hear everything, from the slow churn of a propeller to the faint hiss of compressed air escaping a submarine hull. The Americans had turned the ocean itself into a weapon. When the I-177 intercepted one of these mysterious devices, Japanese engineers studied it in disbelief. It wasn't magic, it was science, and it marked the end of Japan's dominion beneath the waves. The hunters of the Pacific had just discovered that they were no longer invisible. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly, vast and unknowable, a world of silence and shadows that only the bravest dared to enter. For the men of the Imperial Japanese Navy, it was not just water, it was destiny. Beneath those rolling waves, Japan sought to carve an empire invisible to the enemy's eyes. The ocean had no borders, no walls, no witnesses, and in that boundless realm, submarines became the silent sword of the empire. When war erupted in 1939 and the Pacific turned into a battlefield, Japan's admirals were ready to strike from beneath. Their doctrine was unlike that of any other navy. Where the Germans focused their U-boats on merchant convoys in the Atlantic, Japan envisioned submarines as hunters of warships, designed to cripple enemy fleets and isolate entire nations. Their engineers poured effort into crafting vessels that were not only lethal but revolutionary, the I-class submarines. These were not the small, cramped U-boats of Europe. They were giants, over 350 feet long, capable of crossing oceans and armed with torpedoes powerful enough to sink battleships. Some even carried seaplanes that could be launched from their decks to scout enemy territory. To the Japanese Navy, these vessels were the pinnacle of human ingenuity and naval supremacy. In the early months of World War II, their confidence seemed justified. When the attack on Pearl Harbor launched on December 7, 1941, Japanese submarines had already taken their positions across the Pacific. Some lay waiting near Hawaii, others patrolled Australia's eastern coast, while a few prowled as far as the Indian Ocean. Within weeks, Japanese subs had sunk Allied warships and merchant vessels with stunning precision. The I-26 crippled the American aircraft carrier Saratoga, while the I-19 fired a spread of torpedoes that would go down in naval history, striking the carrier USS Wasp, the battleship North Carolina, and the destroyer O'Brien in a single salvo. It was a feat that left even Allied commanders in disbelief. The Imperial Navy celebrated these victories as proof that Japan ruled the sea from the surface to the abyss. In Tokyo, newspapers glorified their submariners as invisible heroes, ghosts who could appear anywhere, anytime. The idea that the ocean belonged to Japan seemed almost divine. In the Shinto spirit, the sea had always been sacred, a living entity, unpredictable yet loyal to those who respected it. The Japanese Navy saw itself as its rightful master, yet beneath this confidence lay a fatal flaw. Japan's doctrine of submarine warfare was driven by pride and tradition, not adaptation. The Imperial Navy had been built to fight decisive battles, large fleets clashing in open water, ship against ship, honor against honor. Submarines, in their view, were extensions of that same philosophy. Tools to ambush enemy warships, not to target supply lines. The Germans, meanwhile, understood that strangling logistics could defeat a nation. Their U-boats hunted cargo ships, choking Britain's lifeline. Japan ignored that lesson. Their submarines attacked combat vessels, often ignoring the merchant convoys that fed the American war machine. Even worse, Japan's command structure kept its submarines under strict control, limiting their range of action. Each vessel operated under rigid orders, leaving little room for improvisation. Crews were trained in discipline and obedience, but not in innovation. They were samurai of the sea, brave, loyal, and tragically bound by outdated ideas. Still, for a time, their dominance was real. In early 1942, Japanese submarines roamed freely across the Pacific, striking fear into Allied sailors. Off the coast of Australia, the I-21 torpedoed ships within sight of Sydney. Near Madagascar, Japanese subs launched surprise attacks that stunned the British Royal Navy. Even the US mainland wasn't safe. The I-25 fired shells at the Oregon coast in a symbolic show of reach. No ocean seemed beyond Japan's grasp. Life aboard these submarines was a mixture of pride and torment. The men who served in them were young, often in their early 20s, chosen for their technical skill and emotional control. Inside the steel hull, space was suffocating. Narrow passageways, constant heat, the smell of oil and sweat filling the air. Silence was their ally and their enemy. For weeks they would drift beneath the waves, cut off from the world above. The only sounds were the creak of metal and the hum of engines. In that isolation, they felt both invincible and invisible. The ocean was their shield, their sanctuary. Yet the war outside was changing faster than anyone in Tokyo realized. The United States, caught off guard in 1941, had begun rebuilding with unimaginable speed. Shipyards that once built freighters now churned out destroyers, carriers, and escort vessels by the dozens. The Allies were learning and adapting. New technologies like radar and sonar began appearing on their ships. The Americans had started to listen to the ocean. Every pulse, every echo, every sound became a clue. What had once been Japan's greatest advantage, invisibility, was beginning to fade. But in 1942, the Japanese submariners could not imagine such a future. They still believed that beneath the waves they were untouchable. When they surfaced at night to recharge batteries, the stars reflected off the water like a mirror of heaven, and the crew felt as though they were guardians of a world untouched by human interference. They sang songs quietly on deck, smoked cigarettes in the moonlight, and wrote letters to families who would never know where they were. To them, the ocean was alive, a companion, a protector, and a silent witness to their courage. What they didn't know was that this very silence, this vast, trusted sea, was turning against them. The Americans were learning to use it as a weapon. They were developing a new kind of listening device, one that could hear submarines from miles away. It was the beginning of a revolution that would strip Japan's submariners of their greatest weapon, the ability to disappear. For now, though, in 1942, the illusion remained. Japan's empire beneath the sea still thrived. Its submarines stalked the depths with deadly confidence, unaware that each mission brought them closer to a future where the ocean itself would betray them. What they believed to be their domain, silent, infinite, and loyal, was quietly being claimed by science. And soon, the very thing that had once hidden them would become the reason they could never hide again. The year was 1943, and deep beneath the rolling blue waves of the Pacific, the once invincible Japanese submarine fleet began to sense something strange, something invisible, something listening. For months, their patrols had returned with fewer kills and more losses. Captains who once boasted of ambushing American destroyers now whispered of unseen dangers, of mysterious noises echoing through the sonar rooms, of Allied ships that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The hunters were beginning to feel hunted. It started with faint pings, rhythmic, metallic, and unnatural. They would echo through the submarine hulls, bouncing off the steel corridors and into the men's ears like the ticking of a clock, counting down to something inevitable. The Japanese crews didn't fully understand it at first. They thought it might be a mechanical glitch, or perhaps an enemy using depth charges in random sweeps. But the pings grew sharper, more precise, always followed by an attack that came from nowhere. Depth charges rained down with pinpoint accuracy, forcing submarines to dive deeper than ever before. For the first time, the ocean no longer felt like protection. It felt like a trap. Unknown to the Japanese, American scientists and engineers had achieved a breakthrough that would reshape naval warfare: Sonar Buoys. Officially known as Sonar Buoys, these small floating devices were dropped from aircraft and could detect underwater sounds, sending radio signals back to the planes above. It was an elegant system, simple, portable, deadly. The US Navy's aircraft could now listen to the sea in real time, tracking the movement of submarines with astonishing precision. It was as if the ocean itself had begun to speak, revealing secrets it once kept hidden. To the Japanese, this technology was almost unthinkable. Their submarines were built on the assumption that stealth was absolute, that the deep sea was beyond human reach. The I-class subs were massive, powerful machines, but they relied on silence, careful positioning, and luck. Against Sonar Buoys, all three became meaningless. The shift began to show in mission reports. The I-40 disappeared near Truk Lagoon without a trace. The I-52, a prized cargo submarine en route to Germany carrying gold and precious materials, was detected mid-Atlantic by Allied sonar and sunk before she even realized she was being tracked. The pattern was unmistakable. Allied anti-submarine warfare had evolved. What had once been a guessing game had turned into science. For Japanese officers, the first clues came when their own submarines intercepted strange American signals on their hydrophones, soft pings and faint modulated tones, unlike anything they had heard before. Curious engineers and communications officers began recording these noises, analyzing them in the cramped sonar rooms deep beneath the surface. When they tried to mimic the sounds, they realized something terrifying. These were deliberate acoustic pulses, designed to locate them. The Americans had learned to see underwater. In one chilling incident, the submarine I-177 reported an encounter that would send shockwaves through the fleet. While operating east of the Solomons, the crew picked up a sequence of rhythmic pings unlike anything in their records. Within minutes, an aircraft appeared overhead. The sub-dove changing depth rapidly, but the pings followed them, adjusting in pitch and distance. Then came the explosions. Depth charges ripped through the water, the hull groaning under pressure as the crew scrambled to maintain control. Somehow the I-177 escaped, but the crew returned to base shaken and silent. They told their superiors they had been hunted by sound. In Tokyo's Naval Command, scientists and officers debated what had happened. Some dismissed the reports as coincidence or bad luck. Others suspected that the Americans had developed a new kind of underwater detection system. But bureaucratic pride slowed action. Japan's military leaders were reluctant to admit that the enemy might be technologically superior. For years, Japan had prided itself on craftsmanship and precision engineering. The idea that an unseen machine could outthink their best submariners was almost heretical. Meanwhile, in the skies above the Pacific, US Navy patrol planes were becoming masters of a new kind of warfare. Equipped with radar, magnetic anomaly detectors, and sonar buoys, they formed a deadly triad of detection. Submarines that once cruised confidently near shipping routes now found themselves ambushed in open waters. The ocean, which had once seemed infinite and unknowable, was becoming mapped, measurable, and lethal. For the men aboard the submarines, life grew even harder. Every surface dive became a risk. To recharge their batteries, they had to break through the waves at night, but now even the night sky betrayed them. American aircraft used radar to spot their periscopes or the glint of water on their hulls. Every sound mattered. A clanging wrench, a dropped bolt, even a conversation spoken too loudly could be picked up by sonar. Silence was no longer a tactic. It was survival. Submarine captains began ordering extreme measures to reduce noise, shutting down engines, suspending cooking, and even banning movement during patrols. Crews sat in eerie stillness for hours, sweating in the tropical heat, praying they wouldn't be heard. The tension was unbearable. Men described the sound of sonar pings like a heartbeat inside the steel, each one reminding them that death might already be coming. The Japanese Navy tried to respond. They experimented with sound-dampening materials and new maneuvering tactics, diving deeper or releasing decoys to confuse sonar. But these were temporary fixes. The Americans were learning faster, aided by an industrial base that could test, build, and deploy new technologies faster than Japan could even analyze them. In 1944, US aircraft carriers began launching coordinated anti-submarine patrols across the Central Pacific. These planes dropped dozens of sonar buoys at a time, creating acoustic nets that could detect and track submarines across wide areas. It was a technological web that no submarine could escape once caught. In one haunting report from late 1944, a surviving Japanese submariner described his last patrol before capture. He said the ocean felt alive with ears. Wherever they went, the sounds followed, the pings, the hums, the distant propellers. It was as if the sea had turned against us, he said. We used to believe she hid us, that she was our mother. But now she betrayed us to the enemy. By the end of the year, Japanese submarines were no longer predators. They had become prey. The mighty I-class vessels that once roamed proudly beneath the Pacific were being hunted with terrifying precision. Sonar Buoys had changed everything. The empire that once ruled the sea's silence now faced an enemy who could hear everything. The age of stealth was ending, and Japan was discovering that the ocean it thought it commanded was no longer its own. The realization that the ocean had turned hostile didn't come all at once. It crept in slowly, like the encroaching darkness of the deep. For years, Japanese submariners had ruled the Pacific's underbelly with quiet confidence. Their early victories, sinking Allied merchant ships, ambushing cruisers, and shadowing American convoys, had built a mythology of invincibility. But by mid-1944, that mythology was collapsing. Reports of missing submarines began to fill Tokyo's communication logs. The proud I-class fleet that once roamed the seas freely was shrinking, one silent disappearance at a time. Every mission seemed to end the same way, sudden radio silence followed by nothing. The Imperial Navy didn't realize it yet, but they were fighting an enemy who no longer needed to see them to kill them. The Americans had turned sound itself into a weapon. Aircraft equipped with sonar buoys and radar would roam the skies, scanning for any hint of movement beneath the waves. The process was methodical and merciless. Once an aircraft spotted a suspected contact, it would release a chain of sonar buoys into the water, each one transmitting a signal back to the aircraft. From above, the operator could hear the ocean come alive through static and sound. A faint hum might become a rhythmic beat, the unmistakable pulse of propellers slicing through the water. Once the target was confirmed, the aircraft's crew would radio coordinates to destroyer escorts nearby, or drop depth charges themselves. In a matter of minutes, the sea would erupt with thunder, geysers of foam marking where a submarine once lurked. Inside those submarines, terror grew with every passing mission. The pings were everywhere now, faint echoes that bounced across steel hulls and down narrow corridors. Men couldn't escape the sound. Even in their sleep they could hear it, a haunting reminder that someone somewhere was listening. Some submariners began to describe the sonar pulses as the voice of death. It wasn't just the danger that unnerved them, but the helplessness of it. They couldn't fight what they couldn't see. They could dive deeper, change course, cut engines, but the pings followed, relentless and patient. One of the most chilling accounts came from a surviving crewman of the submarine I-46. His vessel had been tasked with intercepting American supply routes east of the Philippines. For days they sailed silently, waiting for the right opportunity. But then came the sound, and faint, deliberate, mechanical. The sonar pulses grew louder with each minute. The captain ordered a crash dive, taking the boat to its maximum safe depth. The steel hull groaned under the pressure. Inside, condensation dripped from the bulkheads, mixing with sweat and fear. Then the explosions began. Depth charges rolling down from above, bursting around them in terrible succession. The men clung to pipes and valves, praying the next blast wouldn't crack the hull. Somehow the I-46 escaped, battered, leaking but alive. When they finally surfaced under the cover of night, the crew described the encounter as if the ocean itself had been hunting them. The Japanese command struggled to make sense of these encounters. Their scientists tried to reverse engineer what was happening, analyzing fragments of sonar buoys retrieved from the sea. It was a revelation, small cylindrical devices with simple transmitters and hydrophones. The Americans were using hundreds of these things, blanketing the ocean with listening posts. The realization struck at the heart of Japanese naval doctrine. For decades they had believed that the ocean was too vast to be controlled, that mobility and stealth would always outweigh detection. But the Americans had changed the rules. They had brought science into the fight, turning the vastness of the Pacific into a calculated grid of sound and mathematics. Desperation began to creep into Japanese tactics. Captains experimented with new maneuvers, erratic depth changes and long silent drifts to throw off detection. Some submarines carried noisemakers, crude mechanical devices meant to mimic propeller sounds and confuse sonar readings. Others released oil and debris after being attacked, hoping to trick American crews into thinking they had sunk. But nothing seemed to work for long. The Americans adapted too quickly, refining their detection systems and training crews to distinguish between decoys and real targets. For the men aboard these subs, morale began to erode. The once proud confidence of the Imperial Navy gave way to fear and fatalism. Letters from home were fewer now. Most knew they might never see Japan again. The claustrophobic silence of life underwater magnified every emotion, every whisper of dread, every groan of the hull, every distant rumble above. One petty officer wrote in his log that he had begun to dream of the sonar pings, hearing them even when he was awake. "It is the sound of the end," he wrote. "Each ping is a countdown." Meanwhile, the Americans grew more precise, more scientific. Patrol planes like the Lockheed Ventura and PBY Catalina became predators of the deep. They flew long missions, deploying strings of sonar buoys in wide patterns that created invisible traps across the ocean. The data they gathered was transmitted to ships and bases, allowing coordinated attacks across thousands of miles. What had once been individual encounters between ship and submarine became orchestrated hunts, conducted with the precision of a machine. The Japanese submarines were no longer fighting men. They were fighting a network, a system designed to listen, track, and kill. The psychological toll was immense. Many crews began their missions knowing they would not return. Aboard the I-181, one captain reportedly addressed his men before departure. "We will strike the enemy as shadows in the deep. But remember, even shadows fade." Those words became a grim prophecy. The I-181 disappeared a week later, likely destroyed by depth charges. By late 1944, Japan's submarine fleet was a shadow of what it had once been. The U.S. Navy's combination of radar, sonar buoys, and air patrols had turned the Pacific into a death trap for anything beneath the surface. The ocean, once a domain of mystery and concealment, had become transparent. Every ripple, every sound, every heartbeat of a diesel engine could be heard, analyzed, and targeted. For the Japanese Navy, it was more than a tactical defeat. It was a psychological and philosophical one. The sea, which had always been Japan's symbol of strength and identity, now betrayed them. The once invisible hunters of the deep were being erased one by one in silence. And as each submarine went down, the realization spread through the ranks. The Empire's grip on the Pacific was slipping, and the ocean they thought belonged to them had turned against them forever. By late 1944, Japan's once proud submarine fleet had been reduced to a handful of weary, battered vessels. The tide of war had turned decisively against them, and every mission now felt like a desperate gamble rather than a strategic operation. The Imperial Navy, aware that conventional victories were slipping away, began ordering increasingly reckless attacks. Their commanders spoke of honor, duty, and sacrifice, but beneath those words was the quiet knowledge that Japan's war machine was collapsing. The submarines that had once been tools of offense were now instruments of survival. Sent into seas dominated by American aircraft and destroyers, equipped with technology Japan could neither match nor counter. In this atmosphere of growing desperation, one particular mission stood out. The I-48, an I-class submarine under Commander Kaoru Ashigara, was tasked with intercepting an American convoy off the coast of the Marianas. The orders were simple: attack at night, cripple the convoy, and return undetected. But Ashigara knew the odds. The Americans controlled the skies, their aircraft circling the Pacific like relentless hawks. The ocean was no longer a hiding place, Gus. It was a trap. Before diving beneath the waves, he gathered his men and addressed them. "We are not ghosts," he told them. "We are the last breath of Japan's sea warriors. We fight knowing the ocean is no longer ours, but we fight still." For 2 days, the I-48 stalked the edges of the convoy's route, moving silently in the dark waters. The crew operated with near supernatural precision. No talking, no unnecessary movement, not even the faintest clank of a tool. Every sound mattered. Every vibration could mean death. Then, on the third night, their hydrophones picked up something unusual. rhythmic pulses that echoed faintly through the water. They were not natural sounds. They were too regular, too measured. The sonar buoys were near, the crew tensed. The Americans were laying down a barrier, an invisible wall of sound. Ashigara ordered a halt. The engines went quiet, and the submarine drifted in the darkness like a shadow. The only sounds were the creaks of the hull and the heartbeat-like rhythm of sonar pings. Then came another signal, stronger, closer. The Americans had detected something. Ashigara ordered a deep dive, but even as they descended, the pings grew louder, more insistent. The men knew what came next. Above the surface, a U.S. Navy patrol plane, a Lockheed Ventura, had picked up the I-48's faint signature through its sonobuoy network. The operator's headphones crackled with static, then the unmistakable mechanical hum of a submarine's engines. Coordinates were relayed to a nearby destroyer escort group. Within minutes, the calm Pacific night erupted into motion. The destroyers closed in, guided by sonar, while the plane above dropped flares and depth charges in sweeping patterns. The sea exploded in waves of light and thunder. Inside the submarine, chaos reigned. The first explosions rocked the hull, sending showers of sparks from the control panels. Men were thrown to the deck, gripping pipes and valves as the lights flickered. Ashigara barked orders. "Hard to port! Take her down to 300? The sub groaned under the pressure, but the attacks kept coming. Each explosion seemed closer than the last, compressing the air inside until it felt like the walls themselves were closing in. Then a deafening crack. A pipe burst, flooding one of the forward compartments. The crew scrambled to seal it, but the water rushed in fast. Still, Ashigara refused to surface. "We will not give them our surrender," he said through clenched teeth. The Americans circled for hours, dropping more depth charges in calculated intervals. They knew patience would win. Each charge was like a heartbeat, echoing through the deep, squeezing the submarine's world tighter and tighter. Inside, the crew grew pale from lack of oxygen. Sweat mixed with oil. Condensation dripped from every surface, and men began to whisper prayers into the stale air. Some wept quietly, not from fear but from exhaustion. Then, without warning, the explosions stopped. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. The crew looked to their captain, uncertain whether to rise or stay hidden. Ashigara made his decision. Slowly he ordered the sub to ascend, not to fight but to see if they had survived. The periscope broke the surface, and what Ashigara saw stole the air from his lungs. The horizon was alive with searchlights. American destroyers moved like steel giants, their lights cutting through the waves. The sea that had once been Japan's shield was now under complete Allied control. For the first time, he truly saw the scale of America's power, the coordination, the technology, the confidence. The Pacific no longer belonged to Japan. It had been conquered by science, precision, and patience. The I-48 never completed its mission. Severely damaged, leaking, and hunted, Ashigara ordered a full retreat toward home waters. The crew, though alive, were broken. In their silence, they carried the weight of what they had seen. An enemy who no longer fought the way they understood. The age of intuition, bravery, and stealth had given way to an age of calculation, sensors, and machines. The ocean, once vast and unknowable, had been reduced to data and signals, and the Japanese submariners were relics of an era that was disappearing beneath them. As the I-48 limped back to port, Ashigara wrote a final note in his logbook. "We fought as ghosts against an enemy of lightning and sound. The ocean has turned against us. We dive, but the sea no longer hides us. It listens." His words would later be found among the wreckage when the I-48 was sunk months later near Okinawa, caught again in another American sonar net. It was a fitting end to Japan's underwater fleet, once masters of stealth, now undone by the very silence they had trusted for so long. By late 1944, Japan's once proud submarine fleet had been reduced to a handful of weary, battered vessels. The tide of war had turned decisively against them, and every mission now felt like a desperate gamble rather than a strategic operation. The Imperial Navy, aware that conventional victories were slipping away, began ordering increasingly reckless attacks. Their commanders spoke of honor, duty, and sacrifice, but beneath those words was the quiet knowledge that Japan's war machine was collapsing. The submarines that had once been tools of offense were now instruments of survival. Sent into seas dominated by American aircraft and destroyers, equipped with technology, Japan could neither match nor counter. In this atmosphere of growing desperation, one particular mission stood out. The I-48, an I-class submarine under Commander Kaoru Ashigara, was tasked with intercepting an American convoy off the coast of the Marianas. The orders were simple: attack at night, cripple the convoy, and return undetected. But Ashigara knew the odds. The Americans controlled the skies, their aircraft circling the Pacific like relentless hawks. The ocean was no longer a hiding place, it was a trap. Before diving beneath the waves, he gathered his men and addressed them. "We are not ghosts," he told them. "We are the last breath of Japan's sea warriors. We fight knowing the ocean is no longer ours, but we fight still." For 2 days, the I-48 stalked the edges of the convoy's route, moving silently in the dark waters. The crew operated with near supernatural precision. No talking, no unnecessary movement, not even the faintest clank of a tool. Every sound mattered. Every vibration could mean death. Then on the third night, their hydrophones picked up something unusual: rhythmic pulses that echoed faintly through the water. They were not natural sounds. They were too regular, too measured. The sonar buoys were near, the crew tensed. The Americans were laying down a barrier, an invisible wall of sound. Ashigara ordered a halt. The engines went quiet, and the submarine drifted in the darkness like a shadow. The only sounds were the creaks of the hull and the heartbeat-like rhythm of sonar pings. Then came another signal, stronger, closer. The Americans had detected something. Ashigara ordered a deep dive, but even as they descended, the pings grew louder, more insistent. The men knew what came next. Above the surface, a U.S. Navy patrol plane, a Lockheed Ventura, had picked up the I-48's faint signature through its Sonar Buoy network. The operator's headphones crackled with static, then the unmistakable mechanical hum of a submarine's engines. Coordinates were relayed to a nearby destroyer escort group. Within minutes, the calm Pacific night erupted into motion. The destroyers closed in, guided by sonar, while the plane above dropped flares and depth charges in sweeping patterns. The sea exploded in waves of light and thunder. Inside the submarine, chaos reigned. The first explosions rocked the hull, sending showers of sparks from the control panels. Men were thrown to the deck, gripping pipes and valves as the lights flickered. Ashigara barked orders. "Hard to port! Take her down to 300. The sub groaned under the pressure, but the attacks kept coming. Each explosion seemed closer than the last, compressing the air inside until it felt like the walls themselves were closing in. Then a deafening crack, a pipe burst, flooding one of the forward compartments. The crew scrambled to seal it, but the water rushed in fast. Still, Ashigara refused to surface. "We will not give them our surrender," he said through clenched teeth. The Americans circled for hours, dropping more depth charges in calculated intervals. They knew patience would win. Each charge was like a heartbeat, echoing through the deep, squeezing the submarine's world tighter and tighter. Inside, the crew grew pale from lack of oxygen. Sweat mixed with oil. Condensation dripped from every surface, and men began to whisper prayers into the stale air. Some wept quietly, not from fear but from exhaustion. Then, without warning, the explosions stopped. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. The crew looked to their captain, uncertain whether to rise or stay hidden. Ashigara made his decision. Slowly he ordered the sub to ascend, not to fight, but to see if they had survived. The periscope broke the surface, and what Ashigara saw stole the air from his lungs. The horizon was alive with searchlights. American destroyers moved like steel giants, their lights cutting through the waves. The sea that had once been Japan's shield was now under complete Allied control. For the first time, he truly saw the scale of America's power, the coordination, the technology, the confidence. The Pacific no longer belonged to Japan. It had been conquered by science, precision, and patience. The I-48 never completed its mission. Severely damaged, leaking, and hunted, Ashigara ordered a full retreat toward home waters. The crew, though alive, were broken. In their silence, they carried the weight of what they had seen, an enemy who no longer fought the way they understood. The age of intuition, bravery, and stealth had given way to an age of calculation, sensors, and machines. The ocean, once vast and unknowable, had been reduced to data and signals, and the Japanese submariners were relics of an era that was disappearing beneath them. As the I-48 limped back to port, Ashigara wrote a final note in his logbook. We fought as ghosts against an enemy of lightning and sound. The ocean has turned against us. We dive, but the sea no longer hides us. It listens. His words would later be found among the wreckage when the I-48 was sunk months later near Okinawa, caught again in another American sonar net. It was a fitting end to Japan's underwater fleet, once masters of stealth, now undone by the very silence they had trusted for so long. By the spring of 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy's once-feared submarine arm had become little more than a ghost. The Pacific Ocean, once seen as Japan's hunting ground, now belonged entirely to the United States. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, and patrol bombers roamed freely, blanketing the seas with radar and sonar networks so vast that even the most cautious submarines could barely move without being detected. The Americans had turned the ocean into a battlefield of sound, and the Japanese sailors who once ruled its depths now found themselves trapped within it. Hunted, cornered, and silenced, after the loss of I-370, Tokyo finally began to realize what its surviving commanders already knew. The technological gap had become insurmountable. Japan's sonar systems were primitive compared to the US Navy's advanced acoustic networks. American destroyers could track a submarine's movement through layered sonar triangulation, while carrier-based aircraft deployed floating sonar buoys that could pick up the faintest echo of a propeller from miles away. For every Japanese submarine that left port, there were hundreds of American sensors waiting beneath the waves. The hunter had become the hunted. In the months that followed, several Japanese subs attempted to break through this invisible barrier. The I-401, one of Japan's last experimental subs and the largest of its kind, was equipped to launch aircraft, a daring attempt to strike the American fleet from beneath the sea. But even that colossal machine, brimming with ingenuity and courage, found itself helpless against the unseen ear of US sonar. In one haunting mission report, a surviving officer described how their submarine was followed by the sound of metal tapping on the hull, as if the sea itself knew where we were. The Americans no longer needed to see their enemies. They could hear them, track them, and destroy them before they ever reached striking distance. Beneath the waves, life for Japanese sailors became an exercise in enduring fear. Every sound was a potential death sentence. The creak of a bulkhead, the drip of condensation, even a whispered command could betray them. The crews would shut down engines for hours, drifting silently through black water, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. Some subs ran out of air and supplies because their captains refused to surface, terrified of radar detection. Men suffocated in the dark, never having fired a shot. The ocean that had once been their protector now felt like a tomb. Above them, American aircraft methodically swept the seas. Patrol bombers like the PBY Catalina and the newer PV-1 Ventura could detect a submerged submarine with frightening precision using radar and sonar buoys. Once contact was made, the process was mechanical and cold, efficient, deadly. The bombers dropped depth charges in geometric patterns, guided by acoustic feedback until silence confirmed the kill. There was no dogfight, no heroics, no room for human instinct. It was science versus flesh, and flesh never stood a chance. The fall of Japan's submarine force mirrored the collapse of the empire itself, a tragic unraveling of ambition against the unstoppable tide of American industry and innovation. While Japan's engineers had built some of the most advanced subs of the early war, they could not keep up with the relentless pace of Allied research and production. Every month, new technologies, magnetic anomaly detectors, improved radar, underwater communication systems further tightened the noose around Japan's remaining subs. By mid-1945, even the most veteran commanders understood that the ocean no longer belonged to them. It was not a realm of stealth and glory anymore, but one of surveillance and control. For the Americans, these victories at sea were more than just tactical. They represented the dawn of a new era in warfare, an age when information, sound, and technology mattered more than courage or numbers. The US Navy's dominance in anti-submarine warfare set the stage for Cold War innovations, where sonar arrays and underwater detection systems would define military strategy for decades. What began as a desperate measure to protect convoys had evolved into a complete transformation of naval warfare. The lessons learned from tracking Japanese submarines would later lead to the creation of massive listening systems like SOSUS, a global underwater network that would watch over the oceans for generations to come. For Japan's submariners, however, there was no such legacy as only silence. Their final messages, often intercepted or lost, spoke of duty and resignation. "We are diving now," one captain wrote in his log before contact was lost forever. "The sea is vast, but there is nowhere left to hide." Those words became a grim epitaph for an entire generation of men who had once believed that the sea was theirs to command. When the war finally ended in August 1945, most of Japan's surviving submarines never returned home. Many were scuttled or surrendered to the Allies, stripped of their secrets, and studied by American engineers who marveled at their craftsmanship but pitied their obsolescence. The crews who survived returned to a homeland in ruins, their comrades gone, their missions forgotten, their sacrifices buried beneath history's tides. Yet in their defeat lay a truth that transcended victory or loss, that the sea itself had changed forever. The ocean was no longer the unpredictable frontier it had been when the war began. It had become mapped, measured, and mastered, an arena of total control. What the Japanese submariners discovered, in their final tragic encounters with America's sonar nets, was not just the end of their own war, but the end of an age. The era of human stealth and intuition had given way to an era of machines, sensors, giant signals, a future where even the deep could not keep its secrets. And so, when the last of Japan's submarines sank beneath the waves, they carried with them more than men or weapons. They carried the ghost of a world that no longer existed, a world where courage alone could decide the fate of nations. What they discovered in those final moments was a revelation written in sonar and silence, that the ocean no longer belonged to them and never would again.